I used to work as a security officer. I was asked to work on a Saturday night shift at an old warehouse in Dudley. I turned up at 5 p.m. where the building was a huge brick warehouse with some makeshift offices at the front. I walked in, took the keys from the day officer, and locked the doors behind him. Everything seemed normal for a while. It was a bit creepy as the building was so old, but I was used to that. Around 1 a.m., I got a call from the warehouse manager. One of his night drivers had forgotten his paperwork and asked me to go into the office, which is right at the back of the warehouse, and collect it for him so he could come pick it up. I said fine and headed to the office. The warehouse was pitch black. I had a small torch, but it only slightly lit my way. I walked through until I got to the office door, which was a huge metal sliding door. It made a screeching noise as I pulled it open. As I walked in front of me was the office fax machine, which was blinking and the paperwork was printed out. I grabbed the paperwork, but as I turned around, I looked at the other end of the office and saw what I can only describe as a dark figure hunched over, shivering. I could hear what sounded like breathing, but like if he were freezing cold. I stood there for about 30 seconds motionless, staring at this figure. I turned back slowly and closed the door behind me, rushing back to the front office where I locked the door and waited for the driver. An hour later, the driver collected his paperwork, and for the rest of the night, I had convinced myself it was just the dark playing tricks with me, but it didn't stop me from unlocking the office door or checking the cameras every few minutes. 5 a.m. turned up, and I got a knock on the door from the day officer. I handed him the keys and expected him to come in, but he locked the door from the outside. I asked him if he was going in. He said he doesn't go inside when nobody else is in, but sits in his car in the parking lot and waits. I said, that's a bit strange. He looked at me and asked if I went anywhere else other than the security office. I told him that I went back to the office to get paperwork for a driver, but I didn't tell him the other part. I'll never forget the look he gave me or what he said. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Well, then you know why I don't go in there alone." Gave me chills, but I shrugged it off and just said, "Okay then," and left for home. Safe to say, on the way home, I called my office and requested not to go back there. I used to do trauma scene work back in the 90s, early 2000s. One night, as we worked 24/7 on call, I got a job that a house fire happened earlier in the day that killed multiple people on site. We usually got the call when the fire department or another agency released the property, and they would normally call a company like ours to secure the property. I used to like fires because less to clean up as bodies usually die from smoke and not fire, so no bio cleanup. However, we were always required to board up any opening to preserve the scene and to avoid theft or injury from curious teens or thieves. We arrived on scene shortly after midnight. There was one sheriff car ready to release the scene to us. I exchanged paperwork and my coworker and I got started. Since I knew this was going to be a short, easy just board up the doors and windows, there were only 2 of us needed. The house was a nice 2-story home in a somewhat upscale neighborhood, with a long driveway that had a turn towards the house, so we backed up our truck to the house. Usually there are still bystanders outside when we pull up to a scene, but in this case the entire block was dark, and no one that we saw was outside looking. When you go to a scene of a fire, the inside is still very hot and humid with an acrid smoke smell. We usually wear our protective clothing, so immediately the cool crisp night went to a hot humid sweat. Also typically there is no power, so we are on battery powered lanterns and flashlights. We got started out to the rear of the house, which was the kitchen and family room area. We boarded up the broken windows, as usually the fire department breaks up open venting when they put out a house fire, and also usually cut a hole in the roof to vent. If it was like that, we didn't bother boarding that up since it wouldn't be easy for a thief to climb up on, and would be more dangerous for us to attempt to cover in the night. We knew from stuff left behind from the fire department that whoever died in the fire must have died upstairs, probably couldn't make it out before the smoke overtook them. As we were boarding up windows and sliding doors downstairs, we started to see shadows behind us. At first, you know your mind plays tricks on you, but we were both seeing the shadows at the same time. So we were like, let's hurry up and get the hell out of here. The place was giving us the creeps, and mind you, we were in the business of seeing the worst situations. We suddenly stopped as we heard noises from upstairs. It sounded like someone was moving something heavy across the floor. Now, it wouldn't be the first time we have to chase someone out of a property, but since we are responsible for anyone being inside, we yelled out that they better leave. We would carry hammer hatchets, so we grabbed them and went to the bottom of the stairs and heard what sounded like heavy footsteps. We both went upstairs holding a hatchet in one hand and a flashlight in the other. We went room to room searching for the intruder. We didn't find anyone. Now, it's normal for a house to make a lot of noises after a fire, so we head back downstairs and start to finish off the boarding up, working towards the living room and den area. Again, we heard a loud thud. Like something fell, and then we heard footsteps running. I look over at my partner and we are both looking like we just saw a ghost. My partner was a former football player, so I always felt good with him as my partner because I knew he had my back and he knew the same about me, but for that instance, we were both like two little girls. I think we even grabbed each other. He starts to yell out upstairs, something like we're gonna kick your ass, and starts cussing. I told him, come on, let's go back upstairs. It's probably some teenager trying to scare us. I also told him don't hurt them, but just let them get the hell out of here. Again, we went upstairs, room to room, searched in the closets, showers, behind the doors, nothing. And we couldn't see anything heavy that fell over. We make it downstairs, and we say, let's just hurry up and finish up and get the hell out of here. One last thing to do was secure the front door. If it couldn't be properly locked and closed, we would either use 2x4s or in this case, we screw a hasp on with a lock. We shut the front door and quickly screw in the hasp, and as soon as we locked it, we hear banging from the other side of the door, like if someone was banging on the door. We even felt it too, so it wasn't our imagination. As my partner was leaning on the door holding the flashlight, as I was locking the hasp, I jumped from the door and stood there. I turned to the darkness because my partner was already running down the driveway and jumped in the truck. He turned it on and gunned it down the driveway. I had to run and try to jump in. He didn't really stop, just slow down enough for me to get in, and we were both screaming inside the cab. And I said to him, hey, the back of the truck is still open. He said, fuck that, I'm not stopping it. It wasn't until a few miles down that I got him to stop so I can close up the back of the truck. When we finally got back and went home, I couldn't sleep at all that night, and had almost every light on in my apartment. I work as a nurse at a hospital in the UK that was initially constructed during World War II and was supposed to be a temporary facility. However, that was not the case, and it was further built upon and still remains as a slightly modernized building. I recall doing a night shift during the winter time and had a patient admitted to us with an infection, but otherwise had no illnesses that could affect their cognitive function like dementia or learning disabilities and etc. At around 2 or 3 AM, said patient began to scream from the side room that they were placed in. Myself and another nurse responded. Once in the room, I tried to defuse the situation and calm the patient down. All the while, the patient was screaming about how a man with a bag over his head had been standing at the edge of his bed watching her. As we entered the room, I could tell something was off and felt a shift in energy despite myself telling the patient that there was nothing to be concerned about. Once settled, myself and the other nurse that came with me had turned to leave the room and witnessed what I can only describe as a shadowy figure pass through a set of double doors outside the room. Doors are behind a bit of an alcove, so you can't see them from the side room, but once you leave the room, you can see them. After a few seconds, both myself and the responding nurse clicked onto the fact that the double doors are always locked and have to be unlocked with keys. The time it took from us seeing the figure pass through that area and how long it would take to unlock the doors and lock them again from the other side would be impossible. We both returned to the desks somewhat unnerved for the rest of the shift. I work the late night shift to pay for university and come home at midnight. I share a house with my mom and park my car in garage so you can open with a remote control. You can get straight into the house through a door that connects the garage with the basement, which I normally do except for Thursdays, where I go around the house to pull out trash cans onto the street and then enter through the main door. My house is surrounded by tall bushes, so you can't see much of the street. It's a very rural small village, and I know all the neighbors very well. On a Thursday night, I returned from my shift, and when I drove into our street, I noticed an unfamiliar car with its headlights on. Since I know my neighborhood so well, I was kinda confused about the car, but couldn't see the license plate nor the person sitting in the car clearly, since the light was blinding me. You only drive into our street when you live there or visit someone there, since it only circles back to the main street when you follow it to the end. I opened the gate and the garage door remotely and drove inside. From that point, I can only see the street through the gate since the bushes are so high on both sides. I normally would have left my car and walked inside to grab the trash can, but that day I got a long voice message from a friend and stayed in my car to listen to it. 7 minutes into the message, I lift my gaze and look into my rearview mirror and see a man standing in the driveway behind my car. He didn't move in any way. He just stood perfectly still and watched me. I panicked and locked the doors, then grabbed the remote and closed the extremely slow garage gate. I just sat there for a moment and was too scared to leave the car since I couldn't be sure that he didn't enter the garage before the door reached the floor. I also had to call my mom because the garage door into the basement was locked since I had planned to use the main door. She later told me that she immediately went to the window where she can overview the street since she lives on the first floor, but she couldn't see the man or the car at that point. I told myself it was probably a neighbor who didn't think about how creepy he acted and that I didn't recognize him in the dark. But I asked around and nobody knew the man. I only got the information that that car was seen slowly driving around our neighborhood the last few days. My mom thinks it was somebody that wanted to surprise me and force me to let him into the house to rob us. My grandma had just died and nobody knew that my mom spends the nights over. She thinks he waited behind the bushes and got impatient or confused when I didn't get in the car. We never found out who it was.